is actually about four key questions. Who owns what? Who does what? Who gets what? How are the fruits of labour distributed? And what do they do with it? Consumption, savings, accumulation, and so on. So I suggest that the whole of political economy can be summed up in those four questions, which are questions about the social relations of production and reproduction. So in the rest of the book, these key questions are explored, illustrated, and so on in various ways. The next four chapters of the book are historical, and I'm going to skip over those rather quickly. The second chapter looks at the origins and early development of capitalism, and different views of that, and different contexts. 16th century England, 19th century Prussia, the so-called East Asian models from the late 19th century onwards, Japan, Korea, and so on. And as I say, I'm going to skip that, although the historical chapters are very, very important because they do try to illustrate why or how these concepts work that I'm introducing and applying in the book. And the main sort of point, I suppose, at the end of that chapter is that of a key historical process that, following Robert Brenner, I call the commodification of subsistence, when people, formerly independent small producers, peasants, whatever you want to call them, cannot reproduce themselves outside of commodity relations, are integrated in markets, then their subsistence is being commodified. Even if they don't lose their land, which was Marx's classic model of proletarianization in the English context. So the next historical chapter is on colonialism and capitalism. And well, there's a lot in there, but I structure it in two ways. One is by looking at the periodization of colonialism from Spanish America in the late 15th century to the mid-20th century in Asia and Africa. And then I have a kind of comparative sketch of agrarian change in Latin America, in South Asia, and in Sub-Saharan Africa. And if you take the two together, the periodization and the geographical comparison, it throws up some very interesting and I think important insights. And in that chapter 2, I have, it concludes with a discussion of what I call labour regimes in colonialism. Labour regime, well, it's in the glossary, is a term I use to refer broadly to different methods of recruiting labour and their connections with how labour is organised in production and how it secures its subsistence or reproduction. So the four types of labour regimes in this sense are indicated and illustrated in this chapter, namely forced labour, which slavery of course is a potent and obvious example. I mean, slavery in the period of capitalism, slave plantations of the Caribbean, southern United States, Brazil, and so on. Semi-proletarianization, petty commodity production, and proletarianization. Big words. I'm happy to come back and explain their meanings in response to any questions at the end of this lecture, and for those of you who will be in the classes that I'm teaching tomorrow morning, certainly we can look at this further. Now, in the fourth chapter, I think, again, this is, in a way, quite original and very important. The fourth chapter is called Farming and Agriculture, Local and Global. And it really considers the period from the 1870s to the 1970s. So it sort of deviates a bit from the chronology up to that point. And I point out that throughout most of its history, farming has been a highly localized activity. agriculture is something that happens in modern capitalism and is different from farming. I think that's extremely important. You will find the terms farming and agriculture are often used as synonyms, but in fact, I think analytically, they point to different things. Farming is what farmers do, and what farmers have always done. In modern capitalism, agriculture becomes an economic sector by virtue of the concentration and specialization of capitals upstream and downstream of farming. Upstream, capitals that produce agricultural machinery, that specialize in producing agricultural chemicals, that develop new types of seeds, and so on, and also, very importantly, finance. I mean, finance capital is a very, very important part of agriculture upstream of farming. Downstream of farming refers to things which I'm sure you're familiar with. It's the concentration of capital in these vast modern industries of food processing, food distribution, and so on. So agriculture, the agricultural sector, is not just farmers, it's farmers with these forms of capital upstream and downstream of farming that obviously have important effects for how farmers farm, for their reproduction or their well-being, their prosperity or lack of prosperity as a result of their farming activities. And the other very important thing historically is that agriculture becomes an object of politics and of policy. Now, in the Middle Ages, we might have had feudal landlords and peasants fighting each other, and we often did. That was called class struggle. But in the modern world, we have agriculture constituted as an object of national policy in a different way. Just two examples. Probably the famous original example was the repeal of the Corn Laws in Britain in the 1840s. And I would say one of the most potent examples, perhaps more recently after the Second World War, was American PL 480, Public Law 480, which subsidized American surplus wheat exports to third world countries. So two very classic examples of how agriculture becomes an object of politics and of policy. And I make another important point, in my view, in this chapter, and it's one that has a certain controversial air in terms of some of the debates within SOAS, as Haroon and possibly others would know, which is the classic model of the transition from feudalism to capitalism in farming is a debate about what happened in Britain in the 16th century, what happened or didn't happen in France then and later, and so on. Very Western Europe focus. And it is actually about the transition in farming. It's about the transition from peasant farming to capitalist farming. But the key location, the key site of this shift to agriculture, I suggest, is what happened in the United States in the last third of the 19th century. Accompanied by, not explained by, but accompanied by the development of rail, the railways. In the last third of the 19th century, the United States, also of course Canada and Argentina, became suppliers of a basic food commodity to world markets. That had never happened before in human history. In human history, on the whole, agricultural goods, farm products, had never been transported over large distances to feed populations far away.